Rubinstein, Beatrice Straight, and Oliver Robbins. The film focuses on an average family in the suburbs whose life is suddenly flipped upside down when their young daughter suddenly goes missing after making contact with an unknown paranormal entity. First released on June 4th, 1982, the film was a huge hit, grossing about $121 million against a very small $10 million budget. With the film first conceived and co-written by Steven Spielberg, who was legally unable to be in the director's chair at the time, explains why Tobe Hooper was then brought in for his impressive work on the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Funhouse.
I've never seen The Funhouse. Have you seen The Funhouse?
A long time ago.
Okay. I was unfamiliar with it.
However, through the years, there has been a lot of speculation as to who really directed the film. If you have yet to see this film somehow, or would like to stream it again, you can do so right now with AMC Plus. So I cut my write-up short because I knew that you had a lot to talk about. So, and I didn't want to spoil anything or mess up your traction. So I want to hear what you have to say about the film. I see your notes.
As usual, my copious notes on the film. So, well, this is a movie that both you and I love.
I do, yes.
This is a film that I think when you and James and I sat down years ago, man, that's like 4 plus years ago now, to talk about some of our favorite horror movies for the season.
Yeah, that's right.
That was one that I really shouted out because it's one of my favorite scary films of all time. And this was one that I think you and I both mutually agreed upon doing because the Halloween episode was up in the air for a while. We weren't sure what we were going to do. I know that I gave you a list of some films that I was thinking about covering for the Halloween episode, for my monthly episode. And, saying, what do you think about some of these? And was like, oh, this one might be good, this one might be good. I feel like we probably covered a lot on this one before, just, through pop culture, or people know about this movie so much. And then you said, hey, what about Poltergeist? I said, let's do it, because that's a movie that both you and I really love, and there's a lot to talk about. Both of the main reasons to really get into this film are stuff that we've just mentioned. You mentioned the directing controversy on it, and then a few minutes ago we talked about the curse of the film. So I think it's not only is it a fun movie to talk about, not only is it a great movie, but also it's got these kind of dual stories that I think make the film and the production of the film more interesting.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it.
Where do you want to start?
Well, we just mentioned it in your introduction. Let's talk about the directing controversy.
Okay.
Because that's something that is kind of still debated even to this day, almost 40 years later, as to who really is the true director of this film. Is it Tobe Hooper, who has the credited director? Or is it Steven Spielberg, who kind of wrote, produced, shepherded the project? And from all the research that both you and I have done, kind of was the guy in charge of everything on set.
Yeah. That's what it seemed like, is that he was kind of chaperoning everything in secret.
So, I think you mentioned it in the intro. He was legally bound he was legally unable to direct a film. He was in the pre-production process of E.T. at the time. So this is 1981 is when both of these projects are being worked on. So just post Raiders of the Lost Ark, Spielberg has these two projects on the docket, and I guess he got set up with E.T. at Universal first, and the contract for Universal said, even in pre-production, even if things are delayed, you are not allowed to direct another film. From my understanding, is that E.T. kind of had some delays before shooting started. The reason that Spielberg is kind of so prevalent on this one is because he wasn't working on E.T. at the time because it had been delayed. And because he couldn't legally do it, Tobe Hooper is hired. And I think that was the intention, was that Tobe Hooper would direct it, but because it was kind of Spielberg's project that he had conceived, I think he felt really strongly about it, and that's why he sticks around and is pretty much the shadow director in the movie. Okay, how it started was he wanted to do a sequel to Close Encounters of the Third Kind and kind of make it a much darker sequel.
Okay.
And then had pitched it to a couple of people, I think maybe Tobe Hooper he had pitched it to. And there are conflicting reports as to kind of how the project came about. The one I saw said he wanted to do the project called Night Skies, which is the darker sequel to Close Encounters. When he pitches it to Hooper kind of isn't into the sci-fi aliens angle, says, what about a ghost story? But then other research kind of turned up that Spielberg had always wanted to do a ghost story, and this was that story that he wanted to do. So there's multiple versions of how it kind of came about. But as you said, chose Hooper because he really enjoyed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He thought it was like one of the most visceral film-going experiences he had ever had.
And that was Hooper's debut, right?
Yeah. Yeah, another movie I just rewatched fairly recently, a few months back. And is very, very good and very effective. And another movie that has a shitty remake. So he wants to do this ghost story. Then yet another version of it says he wanted to remake a movie called A Guy Named Joe, which he remade eventually as Always in 1989. It's not a great movie, by the way. It's one of his worst. Along with Ready Player One, which sucks.
You make a lot of people upset with that.
Fuck those people. Ready Player One is garbage. I'll beat that drum as long as I can.
You didn't enjoy the Shining reference?
Whatever. It's like a nostalgia trip movie for fanboys. It's such garbage. But we're not talking about that movie today. We're going to talk about Poltergeist. So he wanted to remake that movie. He calls these two screenwriters in, Michael Grace and Mark Victor. They had written a Charles Bronson movie with Lee Marvin called Death Hunt, which is a pretty solid flick, if I remember. I remember watching that with my dad, years ago. I must have been 10 years old, maybe. And if I remember, it's pretty solid movie. But they had just written that film, and Spielberg was impressed with them. So he calls them into his office, screens A Guy Named Joe for them, and then says he's thinking about remaking it, but also, I have an interest in a ghost story. And then these two writers, Grace and Victor, they turned down the offer to remake A Guy Named Joe, but they say, hey, we're pretty interested in this ghost story, so let's do that. So Spielberg writes a draft, apparently kicks it out fairly quickly, and then hands it over to these guys, and then they do a rewrite on it, and that's kind of their working collaboration, although according to those guys, they really didn't meet up with Spielberg a whole lot. They just kind of had a few meetings with him in the MGM cafeteria. Mm-hmm. and then that was really it. Like, so there's these kind of multiple conflicting reports as to how this film came about, and even Hooper has said that the central story of Poltergeist was something that he had pitched to Spielberg when he turned down the chance to direct the Night Skies, the sequel to Close Encounters. So there's this constant changing story as to kind of who really conceived this film, but in the end, the credits say the screenplay was written by Spielberg and Grace and Victor. The story was by Spielberg, the original treatment is by Spielberg, and Hooper is the director. Now, as production goes on, and because E.T. was delayed, Spielberg's on set virtually every single day of this shoot. And if you watch the movie, which you and I just did last night, it had been a few years since I had watched it. I don't know how long it had been since you had seen it, but it very much feels and looks like a Spielberg movie. It's in something that we're going to talk about here in a little bit when we get to that part, but it's very much a darker version of E.T.
Yeah.
Like a much darker version of E.T. So he's on set a lot, to the point where, as the film was getting close to its release date in June of 1982, there were multiple news stories out in, I think, the Los Angeles Times, I think the Hollywood Reporter, kind of talking about who really is the director of this film. I'm looking at my notes here. So, Spielberg had this heavy involvement. The rumors are swirling. He's actually quoted in a Los Angeles Times story a couple weeks before the film opens, almost sounding like he's throwing Hooper under the bus, saying that Hooper really isn't a take charge kind of guy.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why when decisions needed to be made on set, Spielberg was the one making decisions. Kind of that's how that collaboration between the two of them worked, was that Hooper's the guy directing, in air quotes, the film, and Spielberg's the one that's actually making all the decisions on the project. Yet another thing that happened was the Directors Guild of America opened up an investigation into it, because Hooper's credit as director they felt was kind of being undercut by what Spielberg was saying in the press about how heavily he was involved in it. The investigation, I'm reading from my notes here, the investigation ended with a ruling that MGM, the studio that Poltergeist was made under, must pay $15,000 to Hooper because the film's trailers, which I wanted to watch and slipped my mind to watching before we did the show, but the film's trailer was giving Spielberg a much bigger credit on the film than Hooper. It was basically saying, like from the mind of Steven Spielberg, or, Steven Spielberg production. By the way, end credits at the end of the trailer, directed by Tobe Hooper. So, MGM had to pay Hooper about $15,000. And they ruled that Hooper was the director, even though there was still kind of this broad dispute over who really should have the sole ownership of the film. But then multiple on-set reports kind of come out saying, yeah, Hooper's in the director's chair, he's there, but Spielberg's the one that's storyboarding everything. Spielberg is the one that's setting up the shots. He's there every single day except for a few. And Hooper actually comes out and says, I'm the one that did half of the storyboards for the film. It wasn't just Spielberg. And I think the week that this movie opens in June of 1982, there's a story in the Hollywood Reporter, or an open letter in the Hollywood Reporter that Steven Spielberg wrote to Tobe Hooper, saying that the press was making a big deal and kind of misunderstood the creative collaboration between the two men. Spielberg thanked Hooper for allowing him this involvement in the film, being